Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Institute and Faculty of Actuaries Presidential Address. I'm hesitating for a moment because I can see that people are still joining into the webinar, but for those of you that have arrived here promptly, I know that we should get into this event as quickly as we can. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Annette Spencer and I'm the IFoA's Director of Public Affairs and Research. And today I have the very pleasant task of introducing our new president. And later in the session, I'll also be putting to him some of your questions about his address. So while I am mentioning questions, and I know that most of you by now are very familiar with how to do this in a Zoom webinar, but a reminder that you can ask your questions by using the Q&A function that you should be able to find somewhere around your Zoom screen. And what we will do once Matt has given his address is that we will try and get through as many of your questions as we can. So let me turn to the president himself. Matt Saker has had a 30-year career as an actuary in the life and general insurance sectors, first working in consultancy for many years, and then in-house for over a decade at Aviva, where he ultimately became the group chief actuary. Matt stepped down from Aviva earlier this year, not least to focus his attention on serving the IFoA as its president. Serving the IFoA has been important to Matt for some time. He was elected to the IFoA Council in 2016, and he joined the Regulation Board in 2018. He has also been heavily involved in a number of IFoA initiatives, including the profession's response to climate change and to the IFoA's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion strategy, which was launched earlier this year. I'm not going to say too much more about Matt because I think that it will be good to hear from him as he shares some of his background and career as part of his presidential address. So I'm now going to invite Matt to present that address to us. Over to you.
Thank you, Annette. Hello and welcome, everyone. And thank you, first of all, for taking the time out from what I know are very busy schedules to listen to my presidential address. Look, it's a shame we can't be in Staple Inn, but as many of you know, online sessions like this are the new normal and have the distinct advantage of being easily accessible to many people around the world. So the first thing I want to say is what an enormous honour it is for me to be chosen as president of the IFoA. It's an organisation with a long history, a strong membership and an ambitious global strategy. Over the past year, I've had the pleasure of working as part of the presidential team, helping council and the executive to deliver that strategy. And I think we've achieved a huge amount. We've ridden out the pandemic, and as some of you would have seen from the AGM yesterday, emerged in a strong financial position. We've had over 1,000 new qualifiers in the past year, and we've launched new banking and climate educational offerings. We've also published our diversity, equity and inclusion strategy and have completed another year of running the IFoA Foundation, a charity focused on raising funds to support our communities. I'll bring more colour to some of those achievements later in my address, but suffice to say, I'm really looking forward to working as part of the IFoA team over the coming year as we continue this great work. The theme for my presentation today is flourishing in challenging times, how the actual profession can grow, influence and lead in a rapidly changing world. I'll come back to that later and talk about why I think it's important that the actual profession continues to grow, influence and lead, and what I'll be doing in my presidential year to help that. Before I do that, I just wanted to tell you a bit about me, my career, my personal values, and how I came to be president of the IFoA. So a few quick fire facts about me that hopefully give you a sense of what's important to me and what makes me tick. I'm married to Sue, who after a successful career as an actuary, that's how we met, is now a life coach. And as you can imagine, both of those careers can be quite handy to me. I have two teenage children, George, age 16, who's currently in the middle of his GCSE exams, and Millie, age 14. And there we all are on a holiday in the south of England last year. Being healthy and active is very important to me. My big passion is running. I'm always up for a challenge and for trying new things. And finally, I follow a plant-based diet, which I do for a combination of health. Actually found it made me run faster, sustainability, and also ethical reasons. In terms of my career, and that gave you a flavour of that, I actually start by making a confession. I actually decided I wanted to be an actuary when I was 16 years old. I remember attending a careers day at school. It's a long time ago, but I remember a tall man wearing glasses and a grey suit. There you go, there he is there. Who from memory, I believe worked for Prudential, hence the man from the Pru, talking about what he did as an actuary. It's a long time ago, so I don't really remember the detail of what he said, but whatever he said clearly left an impression on me, as from that point on, I set my sights on becoming an actuary. So after completing my school education, I attended Warwick University, graduating in 1989. And then after taking a year out to travel, I secured a job within the insurance practice of a large consulting partnership called R. Watson & Son, which for me was the start of a 30-year actuarial career, which I found hugely enjoyable. At times challenging, of course, but always rewarding. As you can imagine, things were very different in the early 1990s. I was one of 21 graduates who started at R. Watson & Son that year, of which only 3 were female. I was myself in a minority, being only one of a handful of those recruited that year who didn't come from Oxford or Cambridge universities. My first job title was unqualified assistant. There you go. There's a picture of me back in 1990 when I started my first job. Haven't changed much, have I? The unqualified part, of course, being a reference to my professional status at the time. But I do remember proudly showing off my new business card to a close friend who commented, "Unqualified assistant? You mean you're not even qualified to assist?" Anyway, despite those inauspicious starts, I ended up staying at Watson & Son for 19 years, although by the time I left, it was called Watson Wire and is now part of the Willis Towers Watson Group. Really enjoyed my career as a consultant, but eventually I decided I wanted a taste of the corporate sector. So in 2009, I accepted an offer to join Aviva. I held numerous roles at Aviva, including CRO and CFO roles. But as Annette said, the majority of my time was spent as Group Chief Actuary, where I had numerous responsibilities, including oversight of the actuarial elements of the Group's life and general insurance businesses. And more recently, actually, for the integration of climate and sustainability risk into the Group's risk management framework. So I remained at Aviva until earlier this year, when I stepped down to focus on my IFoA commitments. But the 13 years I spent there were immensely rewarding. I learned a huge amount in all aspects, and I also made some really great friends. Okay, I want to briefly talk about my IFoA journey, as I believe it's one that may resonate with many of our members and is certainly relevant to what I want to talk about later. So like many members, I was highly engaged with the IFoA while I was studying to qualify. Also, like many members, once I'd qualified, I found myself incredibly busy, building my career, learning new skills and doing some really interesting work with little time or indeed inclination really to engage with the profession. Over the subsequent 2 decades, I did the sort of standard things. I attended conferences to get my CPD, and where I thought it would be beneficial to my job, I joined the odd working group. But other than that, I really had very little to do with the profession, which to me felt quite distant and detached, and if I'm honest, at times a little intimidating. So that changed for me in 2016, when I decided to re-engage with the profession by standing for election to council. Several reasons why I made that decision. Certainly, work was more under control than it had been. My children were starting to grow up, so I felt I had the time to do justice to a role on council for the first time. But it wasn't as simple as that. In the preceding few years, I came to realise that my values as an individual, so fairness, integrity, honesty and trust, were really closely linked to those of the IFoA, which led to 2 drivers for me re-engaging with the profession. Firstly, I felt a strong desire to give something back to the profession. And secondly, I felt an innate curiosity to find out more about the IFoA, this organisation I've been affiliated to for so long, how it was run, what were its priorities, and how was it serving its members. So I was fortunate enough to be elected onto council in 2016, was then re-elected for a second term in 2019, before standing for president in 2021. I suspect my story up to the point where I re-engage with the professions is a fairly typical one for the majority of IFoA members. Where my story differs, of course, is that for whatever reason, the majority of IFoA members never feel the desire or inclination to re-engage with the profession. I think that's a real shame. I'm sure that if they did, they would find it hugely rewarding. And most importantly, I think they'd find that they could add a huge amount of value. So if any of you out there are on the fence about whether to re-engage, I'd really encourage you to take the plunge as I did and see how it goes. And you never know, one day you might end up with this round your neck. I was told to try and incorporate this into my speech, so I've managed it. There you go. If you're wondering what this ribbon was, it's the presidential medal that you get when you become president. So what do I mean when I talk about flourishing in challenging times, and why is it important that we grow, influence and lead? Well, over the past 30 years, I feel I have been part of a profession that has flourished. Certainly the profession has grown considerably over that period, and within our traditional fields, we've expanded the work we do and exerted influence at the right level. And as I stand here today, the demand for actuaries has never really been higher. My desire is to see that continue to the extent that my successors in 10, 20, 30 years' time are able to look back on their careers and feel that they too have been part of a flourishing profession. Of course, the challenges of the next 30 years will be very different to those of the past 30 years. So for my desire to become a reality and the profession to continue to grow, influence and lead, we can't simply keep doing the same things we've done in the past. Now, just to be clear, the objective here is not to grow for growth's sake, but I believe that without growth, there is a risk that the IFoA and the actual profession will stagnate, becoming less relevant and thus fail to deliver what's needed for our members and wider society. If that were to happen, then undoubtedly our influence would wane, making us less attractive as a profession, both to current and potential members, as well as employers and other stakeholders, who will no doubt look elsewhere for the skills and roles that actuaries currently fill. Finally, I believe it's important that we continue to show leadership on key societal issues such as intergenerational fairness. As a public interest profession, I believe we have an obligation to fill that role. Turning now to the challenges we face, I doubt there's anyone in the audience today who would disagree when I say the past 2 years have been challenging. We had the initial shock of the pandemic, the rapid move to working from home, turmoil in the financial markets, and as soon as we seem to be putting the pandemic behind us, we have the conflict in Ukraine and the biggest cost of living crisis in a generation. So these are all examples of what tend to be referred to as large world problems these days. But whatever you call them, they're challenges that had a huge impact on the work that we do as actuaries, adding to the longer term challenges we already faced around climate change and the need to make our society more diverse, equitable and inclusive. But the challenges don't stop there, as on top of those large world challenges, there are several smaller world challenges that the IFoA and its members need to consider if the profession is to continue to flourish. Now, these challenges are numerous, but the areas I'm going to focus on today are as follows. The challenge of adapting to a rapidly changing society, the challenge of our own success, the challenge of engaging our members, the challenge of changing false perceptions, the challenge of regulation, and the challenge of creating the right culture. So in talking about these challenges, the first thing I want to make clear is that having challenges is not a bad thing and certainly doesn't imply that things are broken. In a changing world, organisations are constantly faced with challenges, and that's certainly true of all the organisations I've worked for or advised during my career. What distinguishes the good organisations from the bad ones is the way in which they deal with these challenges, with the good ones recognising and proactively dealing with them. And I'm obviously very keen that the IFoA falls into that category. So let's get stuck into it. So the first challenge I want to talk about is the challenge of adapting to a rapidly changing society. So the professions, as we know them today, are largely a product of the 19th and 20th century. Their rise over that period was really primarily driven by growth in population, trade and societies, where they were built on the development of knowledge and expertise for which demand spiraled over that period. But there was perhaps a more sinister side to their growth, in which they were also successful in establishing and protecting their position by creating barriers to entry and controlling and limiting access. So when I entered the profession in 1990, that model was very much the norm. That created a strong expectation on my part that if I could overcome those barriers to entry, essentially passing some pretty tough exams, then I would be able to practice as an actuary for my entire working life. And that's pretty much how it's panned out for me. So that seemed like a reasonable deal. So I made the necessary commitments and sacrifices to qualify as a fellow. But times are changing, causing all professions to ask themselves what role they have in the modern world and how they need to adapt to fit that role. I think there are several reasons why the experience I had will not necessarily hold true for the next generation of actuaries. Firstly, in recent years, we've seen the rise of the so-called semi-professions, where qualification and practice are somewhat less well defined. Best example of that would be data scientists. Now, the barriers to entry for these semi-professions are much lower than for traditional professions. And so in a world where we're conditioned to want instant gratification, perhaps they're more appealing to those deciding on a career choice in the 21st century. There are also threats, I think, to the traditional professions arising from inevitable advances in technology, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, the so-called fourth industrial revolution. So in that context, I asked myself the obvious question. If I were looking to embark on a new career today, then how would I view the proposition that I faced 30 years ago? In particular, would I be comfortable studying my professional exams for, say, 5 to 6 years to become an actuary in the knowledge that by the time I qualified, things could have changed dramatically, with no certainty that those exams will guarantee me a job for life, as they did for me? I also asked myself what employers want. In particular, will they continue to be comfortable investing in the careers of actuarial students? And do they really need all their actuaries to be fellows? Now, I appreciate that's quite a controversial comment for the president of the IFoA to make. But my own feeling here is that while there will always be demand for actuaries, for many employers, particularly those in the non-traditional fields, the associate level qualification may well be sufficient. That was even true for my chief actuary role at Aviva, where, sure, many of my team were fellows, but quite a few of them were, and quite a few of them had very little actuarial training at all. They were just bright, numerate, analytical individuals who, most importantly, from my perspective, were great at their jobs. So how do we address the challenges posed by a rapidly changing society? Well, first, I think we need to be clear on the role the IFoA plays in the provision of actuarial services to the employment market. In my opinion, while the IFoA clearly has a role in promoting actuarial services and in stimulating the demand for actuaries, we cannot and should not seek to dictate that demand. That's the role of the employment market and our members. The role of the IFoA is to respond to those changing demands, support our members, and make sure the supply of actuaries is sufficient, while, and this is really important, maintaining the integrity of the qualification by keeping standards high. So, for example, if the market is demanding that we supply more associate members, either because that's what employers want or because maybe our students become more comfortable with that as a destination qualification, then the IFoA's role is to respond to those demands. If we fail to do so, then surely employers and students will look elsewhere. Now, the IFoA and its members, particularly its fellows, should not see this as a threat or in any way diminishing the kudos of their fellowship qualification, which I believe will remain the gold standard with demand for fellows remaining high. So to meet this challenge, the IFoA has recently set up a programme of work to ensure that the IFoA has a membership model that is fit for the future, retaining and attracting actuaries to meet the demands of a rapidly changing society and providing the right services at a fair cost to our members. I believe we need to put everything on the table here, challenging ourselves to answer questions like how we think the demand for associates and fellows will evolve in different domains over the next decade, what impact this will have on the profile of our membership, and finally, how we should collaborate with non-UK actuarial membership bodies, adjacent professions and semi-professions such as data scientists to further the interests of the IFoA. Having answered those questions, we need to ensure that our membership model is fit and set up to be sustainable in that changing environment, delivering what our members and other stakeholders need and being transparent with our members about what services they're getting and how they are being charged for them. Finally, and this is really important, while we need to be responsive to what our members and other stakeholders need, we shouldn't be shy about what we have to offer and certainly shouldn't allow ourselves to be intimidated or marginalised by emerging competitors. We are the IFoA, an organisation with a long and rich history, which we should be proud of and prepared to fight hard to retain. So moving on, the next challenge I want to talk about is the challenge of our own success. So the first pillar of the IFoA's current strategy is to reposition the profession, a key part of which is a desire to move our members into wider fields. Now, this has been an ambition of the profession for as long as I can remember, but it's a challenge that we have consistently failed to achieve, as you can see by this graph. So why is this? Why are the overwhelming majority of our members still employed in two fields, namely pensions consulting and insurance? Well, I think the simple truth here is that at the current time, there's no burning platform amongst our members to reposition the profession. For as long as I can remember, actuaries have been in short supply, and that continues to be the case today. That's what I mean when I say that the actuarial profession is a victim of its own success. But while demand in our traditional fields is likely to continue for the foreseeable future, I'm far from convinced that will be the case forever. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not expecting to see a material shift in demand for actuaries in the next couple of years, or even perhaps the next decade. But I think it is likely to happen within the careers of many of our current members, and almost certainly within the working lives of those who are just starting on their careers today. In that context, I think it would be naive of us to think these changes will not require the actuarial profession to adapt and transition. And it's essential, I think, that we start to plan and think about these issues now. The dilemma we face, of course, is that although we believe this change will happen, as I said earlier, our members are currently fully occupied and there's no burning platform for them to reach out and consider new roles. We are having an imbalance in supply and demand, with the IFoA essentially seeking to supply services for which the demand does not yet quite exist within our membership. I think the most obvious example of this is climate change, where I believe the opportunities for our members are huge, spanning all sectors, including our traditional domains. But the world won't wait for actuaries to move into these domains when it suits us. If we don't move quickly, then in a similar way to the recent raise in data scientists, others will surely move in and seize the opportunity from under our noses. So how do we make this change? How do we ensure that actuaries get a fair share of the action at a time when our members are fully occupied? And how do we ensure that they don't miss out on what I believe are some fantastic future opportunities? Well, a great example of where this has worked well in the past is general insurance. So when I entered the profession in the early 1990s, there were very few actuaries working in general insurance. But our members saw this as an opportunity. They moved in to fill the space, and the IFoA followed to adapt and support them. And if we look at our membership today, as you saw in the graph a couple of minutes ago, we have almost as many actuaries working in general insurance as we do in life insurance and pension consulting. And it's one of the strongest growing disciplines within the profession. I think that's a huge success story. Building that example, the key point I want to make here is that for actuaries to be successful in these new fields, such as climate change, it will take effort from both the IFoA and our members. This has to be a partnership. As I've discussed already, the IFoA has a key role to play on the supply side, continuing to develop our examinations and lifelong learning, broadening our offer, building on initiatives such as the launch earlier this year of the Climate Risk and Sustainability course, and the formal accreditation of the ASSA's online banking modules. As I said earlier, the IFoA also has an important role to play in raising the profile of actuaries and stimulating demand for actuarial skills, particularly with new employers. But that's only half the story. As to fully exploit these opportunities, we need our members to actively seek them out. The reason actuaries moved into general insurance wasn't because roles were drying up in life companies, far from it. It was because a few innovative pioneers saw an opportunity which they then exploited. As these pioneers thrived, others followed, and the rest is history. I believe the same will be true for climate change and other new domains. That will only be the case if both the IFoA and its members seize the initiative. That partnership model between the IFoA and its members is what the profession has always used. It's proved very successful in the past, and I believe will continue to serve us well in the future. Okay, I want to move on now to talk about the challenge of engaging our members. So within the walls of Stakeholder, a huge amount of work has gone into developing our member value proposition over the past few years. However, I think we've been a little bit cautious in communicating our plans and the output of that work to our members. We know for a fact that many changes we are thinking about, such as the introduction of a chartered designation for associates and fellows, are viewed as threatening by some of our members. At the other end of the spectrum, many of our current and potential members view the IFoA as being somewhat slow and cumbersome. There's also a sense from some sections of our membership that they are being neglected or taken for granted by the IFoA. Whether or not we agree with them, we need to embrace these perceptions. And while of course it's impossible to keep everyone happy all the time, we need to ensure we are clear on what we are offering to our diverse membership and ensure that this represents good value to each of them. So a few facts about the IFoA. Our membership grew by more than 10% over the past 5 years. We have over 3,500 active volunteers. In the last council elections, less than 2,000 of our members voted. 12.5% of our members took part in the most recent membership engagement survey. And our recently launched Sustainability Hub has received 1,800 visits since its launch last November. Okay, so I asked myself how I feel about those figures. I certainly feel pleased about how the IFoA is growing over the past few years, and I'm very proud of the volunteer structure we have in place. On the other hand, I can't help feeling that the response rate on our membership survey is low. Similarly, I feel somewhat disappointed by the small number of members who vote in council elections and the relatively low engagement rates we have for some of our really good thought leadership initiatives. Now, from the numerous conversations I have with members, my feeling is that the reason for so many young members aren't actively engaging with the profession isn't because they're harbouring any strong resentment against the profession. It's just that on their ever increasing to-do list, the IFoA is not a priority for them. And they don't see, or perhaps simply not aware of what the IFoA can do for them. That's certainly how I felt in the 20 or so years where I was disengaged from the profession. Okay, so how, as demonstrated by the second pillar of our strategy, which is transforming the membership experience, the IFoA is very focused on changing this situation. But we shouldn't assume or expect that members will engage with us just because we want them to. There needs to be a reason for them to do so. The IFoA has to be offering them something that they need. That was the thinking behind the Member Pledge, which we published a few years ago, and drove recent initiatives such as the New World, New Thinking campaign, when we announced that online seminars would be free to our members. I mentioned earlier the launch of the DEI strategy in January, reinforcing our strong commitment to champion and embody the benefits of a globally diverse and inclusive profession and to not tolerate discrimination in any form. Some of you will hopefully also have noticed the new, more user-friendly IFA website that we launched in March, and new members will certainly be benefiting from the streamlined online signing up process. In addition to those initiatives, and there are many more, I would also note the promise made at yesterday's AGM to keep subscription fees flat for another year. In real terms, subscriptions have actually reduced by over 20% over the past decade. I think in the context of the ongoing cost of living crisis, it's great that we're able to offer that commitment to our members. So clearly time will tell whether these initiatives move the dial. I'm optimistic that they will, but either way, it's clear that we need to do more. And so the IFoA will continue to listen to its members and will remain committed to making further changes to improve the membership experience. We need to be realistic here about what can be achieved, but I'm confident that if we continue to do the right things and are open and transparent with our members, then over time we will see a continued shift in membership satisfaction and engagement. Okay, so moving on. The next thing I want to talk about is the challenge of false perceptions. So one of the frustrations of my career so far is my continued inability to articulate in a succinct, engaging and clear manner what I do for a living. So I'm sure, like me, having told someone you're an actuary, you receive a look like this, or if you're lucky, an entertaining comment. I think the best one I got was, "Oh, an actor, that's interesting. What films have you been in?" So look, while the reasons for this lack of understanding, I think, are clear, our profession is small, niche, it's quite technical. The work we do impacts on nearly every member of the public in some shape or form. So I think it's disappointing that we have such a low profile, seemingly only raised when a major negative event occurs. So the example I've just given highlights a wider challenge, I think, around how the profession and its members are perceived by external stakeholders. Most material, I think, of these is caused by a fundamental misunderstanding of what we do as actuaries. To demonstrate this further, if you type actuary definition into Google, then the response you get is this: actuary, a person who compiles and analyzes statistics and uses them to calculate insurance risk premiums. So I'm not denying that that is something that actuaries do, but to be frank, it feels like something you'd have come up with in the 1800s when the Institute of Actuaries was first established. Of course, we all know these days actuaries do far more than that, but do others? And by others, I mean all the key stakeholders that we should be looking to influence as individuals and also as a profession. Those include employers, regulators, policymakers, and the wider public. Taking one of those stakeholders groups as an example, we have a really strong profile with the current large employers of actuaries, but we're virtually unknown by employers outside of the financial services sector. I think that's a shame, as I think there's so much value we could add in those wider fields, if only we could raise our profile and change those perceptions. So how do we do that? How do we go about changing the perceptions? Well, I believe we need to be clearer on who we are, what we do, and the value we can add. To achieve this, we need to be bolder and more confident in ourselves, both as individuals and collectively through the IFoA. Importantly, that requires us to push ourselves outside of our comfort zone. So, for example, linking back to what I said earlier about the role of the IFoA in stimulating demand for actuarial skills, I think we need to spend much more time talking to potential future employers of actuaries about what actuaries can do for them. Although challenging and difficult, if the profession is continued to flourish, then I believe that's essential. We also need to be more visible in the press and wider society, expressing strong views and exerting influence at the right level on the relevant issues of the day. I know that many members feel we are less influential than the past. Of course, that's a subjective judgment, but what I would say is it's not due to the IFoA or its members being less active than in the past. The profession has more than doubled in the past 10 years and is now producing more thought leadership output than ever before. I think the challenge we have is that we're now competing in a much more crowded space than in the past. And in that environment, it's more challenging to get heard and to differentiate ourselves. Notwithstanding those challenges, it's essential that our voice is heard. A great example of where that's worked well is during the pandemic. The pandemic shone a light on the work of actuaries. We created the COVID-19 task force and provided regular updates on the impact of the pandemic. That was great for the profile of the profession. That's one example, but there are many more, including our COP26 engagement and the work you would have seen on the Great Risk Transfer and the insurance poverty premium. I think we need more of this great thinking, and we need to tailor that output to the needs of different stakeholders. Certainly one size does not fit all here. More broadly, we need to keep pushing ourselves to change false perceptions about who we are and what we do. And wouldn't it be great in a few years' time, when we talk to people about what we do for a living, we get a more positive reaction, or dare say a different answer when you Google what actuaries do on Google. Okay, moving on. When I talk to colleagues about the profession, probably the most emotive subject is that of regulation. This is what it feels like. And I know that members have a strong sense that they are subject to too much regulation. Sadly, there's no easy answer to this. As a profession that was established under a Royal Charter that requires us to act in the public interest, it's essential that the IFoA has the infrastructure in place to ensure that our members act professionally. And rightly or wrongly, wherever you look in society these days, regulation is on the increase, and the actual profession is certainly not exempt from that trend. So as Annette said, I've been a member of a regulatory board since 2018, and I believe we're striking the right balance here, applying regulation in an appropriate and proportionate manner. Importantly, we've listened to feedback from our members and reflected this in things like the new outcomes-focused CPD scheme, for which we've had really positive feedback from members, and also the soon-to-be introduced revised practice certificate renewal process, which many of our members will benefit from. But as you all know, regulation of the IFoA and its members is not solely within the gift of the IFoA. In particular, responsibility for setting the technical actuarial standards, the TASs, and for oversight of the IFoA sits with the Financial Reporting Council, the FRC. So that brings me to one specific area of regulation that I'd like to flag, which is the ongoing review of UK corporate governance by BEIS. A part of that review looks at the way in which IFoA and its members are regulated, raising challenges around whether this regulation is broad enough and deep enough. Now, although very UK focused, I can't overstate the importance the IFoA and all of its members, including non-UK members, of ensuring that this review reaches an appropriate conclusion. For that reason, the executive, together with a group of senior volunteers, have been working hard to lobby for what we believe to be an appropriate outcome. Now, while there's still quite a lot of road to run on this, the good news is that recent announcements seem to be suggesting that our lobbying has been successful, and certainly that the powers that be are listening to our views. That's all I wanted to say about regulation, but hopefully it provides you with some comfort that we are focused on ensuring that the regulation of the IFoA and its members remains proportionate. Okay, throughout my career, I've witnessed the importance of organisations having the right culture, and this is the final challenge I want to talk about before wrapping up my address. A past criticism of the IFoA has been that perhaps we've not had the right culture. In particular, some would claim the IFoA has maybe been too focused on its commercial activities at the expense of membership services. As I noted earlier, others would say the IFoA is too slow to react and that things take longer than they should do. So those concerns were recognised by Council when developing our current strategy and led to several important initiatives, one of which was the development and publication of the IFoA's purpose and values. So the IFoA's purpose is here to be the voice of actuaries and to support, develop and be the voice of its members. And that's supported by those four values: to be member focused, action orientated, forward and outward looking, and team driven. So I think great progress has been made in embedding that purpose and values throughout the organisation, and hopefully that's evidenced by some of the initiatives I've talked about today. But we're only still partway through the journey, and there's certainly more work to do to take that purpose and values from being mere words on a page to the mechanism which defines our culture and drives us to become a more dynamic, efficient and member-focused organisation. Having the right culture, importantly supported by strong governance and capabilities, isn't a choice. It's a fundamental requirement and allows an organisation to build on solid foundations rather than on sand. And I think if we don't get this right, then it will be impossible for us to meet the various challenges that I've discussed during this address. Okay, hopefully over the course of this address, I've given you a flavour of what I consider to be the main challenges facing the IFoA and how we're addressing them. By way of conclusion, if I were to summarise what I believe needs to happen to address these challenges, then I'd say the IFoA needs to do the following. We need to recognise and adapt to the changing needs of society, our members and other key stakeholders. We need to facilitate demand for actuarial skills in new domains and work in partnership with our members to take advantage of the opportunities created. We need to raise the profile of the profession and continue to produce engaging thought leadership content. We need to work hard to change the false perceptions that exist around who we are and what actuaries do. And finally, we need to ensure that the level of regulation to which we're subjected is proportionate so as not to stifle our ambitions. Underpinning those is the need to create the right environment and culture to support our members. So, unlike many previous IFoA presidents, I don't intend to have a theme for my presidential year. I think there's already plenty for the executive and their teams to be getting on with. Instead, my priority as president will be to do everything in my power to support the IFoA in delivering its current strategy. It's a strategy that as a member of council, I helped to develop and I believe is the right way forward. To that end, I plan to practically engage with the IFoA's myriad of stakeholders and ensure that we hear and act upon their feedback. And as we finally emerge from the pandemic, I hope to be as visible as possible, particularly with our most important group of stakeholders, our members. So as has been the case for all senior roles I've held during my career, I see myself as a temporary custodian of the IFoA presidential role. With that in mind, as with the case with all previous roles, my ambition is to leave things in better shape than when I found them. So I'll let others decide in a year's time whether they think I've achieved that, but I'll finish simply by going full circle and referring back to that actuary wearing glasses and the grey suit who visited my school in the mid-1980s. In particular, there's lots I want to achieve over the next year, but from a personal perspective, if my term as president results in a handful of people entering the profession who would not otherwise have done so, then I would consider that a success. And who knows, maybe in 30 years' time, one of them will be stood in front of the next generation of actuaries giving their presidential address. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Matt. I think that has been an ambitious message in many ways. I like the idea that we should be aspiring to flourish. And I think that that will inspire not only a new generation, you know, the young actuaries that might be president in 30 years' time, but I think also all of us who've been listening this morning and no doubt the wider profession as well. I thought your articulation of the challenges that the profession is facing were very clear as well. And I like the fact that they don't seem impossible challenges to try and tackle, albeit I'm not saying it's necessarily going to be easy. So thank you for the presidential address. We are going to move into the Q&A section. So thank you for the questions that we have already been receiving while Matt was speaking. And just a reminder that you can use the Q&A function as the way to send us your questions. So we have a reasonable amount of time left in the scheduled session. I'm going to try and put as many questions as I can now. Are you ready, Matt?
Ready as I'm ever going to be, Annette.
Excellent. Well, look, let's start with, in some ways, quite a big question, but quite a sort of focused question, picking up on the theme of your address, at least. So, how will you determine or measure if we are flourishing better as a profession in 12 months' time at the end of your term?
Okay, that's a great question. I guess my first reaction to that, Annette, would be 12 months. I know that's the term of my presidential year, so that's why you've asked, or someone's asked the question. But You know, 12 months isn't the right time frame, I don't think, to measure these things. You know, when I talked about being a member of a profession that's flourished over my 30-year career, you know, it's important to recognise there's been some ups and downs there. I mean, the equitable debacle happened 10 years or so into my career. So, you know, the overall trend has definitely been upwards, but it feels like a little bit like a stock market chart, if you like. You know, there's been the odd crash from time to time. So I think it is important to recognise that. And when I spoke in my address, I talked about, you know, my successes in 10, 20, 30 years time. So I suppose that's the time frame I had in my head. That said, I do think we need to be challenging of ourselves, actually, and set some ambitious but achievable targets in all the areas where we need to make progress. One of those, of course, was membership engagement, where we do the annual survey of members. So the results of that were published in the Actuary a few months ago. So we'll continue to do that work, and that's one of the most important outputs, because it gauges whether things are moving in the right direction with our members. We also do employee surveys, which will hopefully give us a sense of whether the culture of the organisation is moving in the right direction. And I think you yourself, actually, Annette, in your team, you run a sort of awareness survey, so testing how various stakeholders perceive us. So again, we can set some targets there, as well as perhaps, you know, I've talked a lot about moving into new domains, which is something we have spoken about as a profession for a long time. We haven't really ever set targets for that. I know it's difficult, but perhaps we should start doing that. We have actually quite limited information about where our members work outside of the sort of core areas. There's this big miscellaneous bucket that we don't have great visibility on. So look, we should absolutely set some clear targets and judge ourselves relative to those. But at the same time, you know, we shouldn't be too focused on you know, short-term trends. You know, the main thing, I think, is that we continue to do the right thing and monitor those trends over a longer period.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense, that actually the thing we can only do in the short term is track progress in the right direction, that this has got to be a long-term ambition, in a sense, to make the change. I think I've also picked up a bit of an action there to look at how we can build on the insight we're already doing, and you summarised the kinds of things we're doing really well there. But I agree with you, it would be good to get more detail on the sort of category of other, which in and of itself doesn't give us much information. So thank you very much. Great answer. So I'm going to move on. You talked in your address about defining what the actuarial profession actually does, and, you know, the amusing responses you can get from people outside the profession. So one of our members, I'm going to give him a name check, Martin Lunnan, he shared in the Q&A that he has a little one-line definition. He says that what he does is the maths and statistics that underlie pensions and insurance. So that's a nice, short, sharp explanation, albeit it's obviously anchored in our traditional areas. But thank you, Martin, that's very helpful. So there's then a kind of question which I think is quite topical for people who've been following the news in the last week or two. So you talked about what you called competitor semi-professions. And obviously talking about you know, people who might work in other fields of data and that kind of thing, the kind of people that you employed when you were at Aviva. And the question says that obviously this is not unique to actuaries or to our profession, and there's quite a lot of coverage at the moment about the challenges in the medical profession with physician associates and physician assistants, and kind of whether people understand the different levels of qualification and so on. So the question is two parts. To what extent are you looking at how we compare with other professions? Are there things we can learn? And also, what can we do to help employers understand and potentially not misuse people operating at different levels of qualification?
Yeah, thanks, Annette. Thanks, Martin, for your question. Firstly, just on your definition, the maths and statistics that underlie pensions and insurance. So again, accurate. I'm not sure that would spark a really great conversation with a member of the public, though. So I get where you're coming from, but I don't know. Maybe we should run a competition or something to come up with the perfect definition of an actuary. Maybe try and get it changed on Google. I don't know. But look, I mean, turning to your question, do we engage with other professions? We do tend to. I'm not sure whether we've specifically had this conversation with them, so that's something we can certainly think about. In terms of the second part, how do we stop employers misusing those alternative semi-professions? I mean, I think this is part of the story we need to get across to employers. You know, I've always felt that actually, you know, the regulation of us as members and of the IFoA, it's in everyone's interest. It's certainly in our interest as members to make sure that the integrity of the profession is upheld and people are called out if they're not doing the right things, essentially. But I also really feel strongly that actually, as much as it's in our interest as members, it's in our employers' interest to make sure that they are confident that the actuaries that are doing, you know, really critical work for them are part of the IFoA and are subject to the actuaries code and all the standards that they need to be compliant with. And I think that's a mess. I think employers take that for granted, and I don't think they should, particularly with the rise of semi-professions who aren't subject to all those standards, particularly the ethical ones. So I think that's a message we need to get out to employers more clearly, that actually, you know, that's why they should value actuaries, because it's in their interests that they're subject to this regulation, and for them to know that actually they're doing CPD to make sure they're keeping their skills and everything else up to date.
It helps if I unmute myself. I'm sorry, that was going to happen at least once in this session, but there we are. I was just thanking you for that answer because I think you've addressed that really well. And it strikes me there's a balance between comparing and understanding what other professions are doing and talking to them, but actually also being clear about what is unique and what is important about what we do as a profession. So I think you captured that in what you were saying there. So we're kind of staying with the challenges around the profession. So the next question that I'm going to move on to, a couple of questions we've had in this area actually. So there's, you talked about how we can try and grow demand for associates and fellows, particularly, you know, not just in the UK, but around the world. And so the question is really, what are your ideas for how we do that? And in particular, I think this may reflect the questioner's line of work. They're interested in how we can encourage more actuaries into investment and asset management, and in particular, can asset managers themselves be doing more to attract actuaries? So kind of starting quite broad and then perhaps moving down into the specifics of the asset management sector. What can we do?
Yeah, I gave the example of general insurance actuaries. I mean, in some ways, I wouldn't say that was easy, but it was a natural area for our members to go to because it was sort of, you know, within the insurance sector, so close to home, if you like. But that is a real success story. I think we have struggled as a profession to broaden out beyond that, including actually within financial services, although we do have quite a few people working in asset management these days, and also more and more people working in the banking sector. How do we make that happen more? Well, as I said, it has to be a partnership. So, you know, and I gave the example of climate change. I genuinely think that climate change is an example where, you know, the profession could broaden out for the first time really beyond its traditional financial services home. The IFoA, I think, is doing a good job of providing material. I mentioned the Sustainability Hub. There's some really great stuff there if people take the time to take a look. You know, we need to call on the entrepreneurial mindset of our members to drive into these new domains. I think climate will be a success if we do that. Other areas, you know, we will win some, we will lose some, but I'm optimistic that in, you know, 10 or 15 years time, the profile of our membership will be much broader than it is today. I generally do think that the changes that are happening in the pension sector, with the sort of gradual decline of DB schemes, automation, as I said, within insurance companies, will make that a necessity at some point. Certainly, as I said, within the careers of many of our members. But I'm keen that we don't wait for it to be a necessity. We get on the front foot and start driving that change now. So again, I keep saying, but it's a partnership. It has to be a partnership. And I think if we think about it, I mean, we need to get more visibility on where our members are working. I've had a few random conversations with people. I had a conversation with one member a while back who was working advising NHS trusts, just performing what probably we would consider to be quite straightforward cash flow projections for them, but providing massive insight to them. It's a skill that actuaries have, and I think we undersell ourselves quite often. Because we can do it and it comes natural to us, it doesn't mean it's natural to everyone else. And I think we can add huge values in fields like that, and I'm sure multiple others. No one can tell me that all these energy companies, supply companies who went bust recently, they could have done with an actuary, I would suggest, highlighting the risks of their business model, a few simple calculations. I'm not saying that company should be employing an actuary. Of course, I'm not saying that, but I think our skills are quite applicable outside of our traditional homes.
I'm going to come back with an immediate kind of follow-up on that, because you've talked about climate change as one of the areas that you think the profession can really make a difference in and broaden out to. One of the questioners has also highlighted all the work that's been done over the past 2 years by ICAT and the ARG group in COVID, and the way that has positively raised the profession's profile. So I just want to kind of quick fire question of climate change, COVID, you've talked about the health service, anywhere else, energy companies you've talked about, just any other off the top of your head areas where you think we could be expanding into?
Well, those are good examples. I mean, I've always felt, pharmaceutical companies that need sort of, data analysis. We are, as many people keep saying, we are the original data scientists. Organisations that need, complex data to be analysed, and most importantly, that data to be interpreted and communicated clearly to senior stakeholders. I think wherever you go, big pharmaceutical companies, big energy producers, there's a long list of where we could become engaged. I mean, we need, but we shouldn't be too scattergun. We need to decide ourselves, I think, where we want to focus, and the obvious areas are, as the previous question said, are probably nearer to home. So it's great, I think, that we have the banking route to fellowship now. More and more people are moving into asset management and working for investment banks. So those are the natural areas for us to try and exploit initially, but then to get into these wider fields and really sort of broaden things out. And as I said, we won't be successful everywhere. But that's how evolution works, right? We'll win some, we'll lose some, and the ones that we win hopefully will continue to grow.
Yeah, so you're reminding me of how we use that phrase adjacent. We talk about adjacent fields, don't we, as well as wider fields, and that actually will make the quickest progress in those adjacent areas. And of course, in my line of work, we talk about test and learn. So the idea is that you fail fast, isn't that what they say? That you try things and some will work and some won't. So I like that you're reflecting that spirit. It's giving us a real sense of how you'll approach the year. Go on.
But I was just going to say, I mean, I think we need to think. I talked in my address about our learning offering, and particularly our post-qualification offering, but also pre-qualification. I think we're making some great changes there, but I think in some senses, and our whole qualification structure, sort of because of the nature of the later exams, particularly the fellowship exams, they tend to sort of funnel our membership back into our traditional areas. And I think that's starting to change now, as I said, with the sustainability course that we've launched and the banking route to fellowship. But we need we do need to think about that quite carefully, because I think that fellowship route shouldn't be funneling people back. It should be, so you can't see my hand, it should be trying to do this rather than that, if you like. And that's something I think we do need to think about. It's not easy to do, and it's not something we can change like that, but it's something we should think about changing over time.
So broadening out, but in a targeted way, is, I think, a summary of what you've explained there. Thank you, because I kind of came back with a bit of a follow-up question there. So we do have a question from a past president, and I always feel that I should make sure I ask the new president the questions from the past presidents. So this is a past president, and they've said that, thank you, you've been very clear on your objectives for your presidential term, but they're a bit less clear on what you're actually going to do to achieve them. So could you share a bit more on specific actions to address the challenges you've talked about?
Well, I try to be specific in my address. I mean, certainly, you know, in terms of how we adapt to a changing society, yeah, there's work that's kicking off now that will address issues like that. As I say, there's lots of work going on already about the member value proposition. As I said in my conclusion, you know, I don't want to have a theme which is going to distract the executive from you know, delivering the strategy, which I think there's a huge amount to do, and you know, I don't want to add to their to-do list in any way. So yeah, there is a huge amount going on. My role, I think, is to help support the IFoA team. I'm part of the IFoA team, and I want to do everything I can to support them. So, you know, I'm the president, so I can't get too operational, but you know, where I can get my hands dirty, I'm not averse to that. And so I can assure everyone that I am, you know, yeah, I stepped down from Aviva in the year, so I'm dedicating a lot of time to help the IFoA team to kind of deliver these initiatives. And I'm really looking forward to kind of getting out and about. I do feel very passionately about that. I'll be reaching out to all of our regional societies to get out, and hopefully, if they'll have me, to talk to as many of those as I can over the next few months, because I do want to hear what members think. And I'll have a huge focus personally on hopefully helping to improve the member engagement scores, because that does appear to be an issue.
Thanks, Matt. And I think that open invitation to, in a sense, our sort of adjacent bodies, our regional societies and that kind of thing. I suspect, given how many people are listening to this, you may get a few invitations after today. So that's very clear, and I hope that has addressed the past president's question. So I am then going to move on to a question about really about you talking about the next generation, and indeed sort of how we are developing the profession. And this question is focusing on how we might partner in future with universities. So it's really kind of your views on and your aims in how we develop the relationships with universities, and also in particular how you think we can become more attractive to what the questioner has described as the best, brightest and most ambitious graduates. And I know that your work on a number of committees for us prior to becoming president, I know this is a subject that you care a lot about. So how are we taking that forward?
Yeah, I mean, first thing to say, we're already doing some great work there. I mean, we have links with universities all over the place in the UK and outside of the UK, and those ties are really good. We have really good relationships. We've worked quite closely with several of those. For example, developing the data science credential that we launched a few years ago. That was done in collaboration with the university. So I think those ties are good. We can always, of course, do more, and we'll continue to keep that under review. You know, I didn't talk much about our diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, but that is relevant here. Part of that strategy is to very much focus on the things that are under our control directly as the IFoA, but also to work on the organisations such as universities that we work closely with, and make sure that they are operating in an appropriate way that's aligned with our strategy and our values. So, making sure that they are encouraging diversity and inclusion in every way is one of the big focuses of our strategy. So, we need to, and to be frank, if organisations aren't showing those values, we shouldn't be working closely with them. So there's work to do there, but I think we're in reasonably good shape in terms of making us appealing to the brightest and the best. I would hope we are, and certainly I felt that when I entered the profession 30 years ago. I still believe that we're getting our more than our fair share of the best and the brightest, but we shouldn't be complacent, and I think we do need to. I talked about the perceptions amongst potential new members. I do think there is if our competitors, so other actual membership bodies were looking to criticise us, they would point to us being slow and cumbersome. Their words, not mine. It did, until relatively recently, the whole signing up process for new members was a horrible process. It used to take ages. We've now completely changed that. It's far more slick these days. It's much easier for new members to sign up. And that's the kind of thing that really turns off the best and the brightest people from joining. They'll just sort of disengage and go somewhere else. So we need to get those things right. And then once we've got their attention, we need to be telling the story of the great opportunities that being a qualified member of the IFoA offers them, which hopefully everyone in this call, I don't need to tell. I mean, hopefully you will agree, otherwise you wouldn't be here this morning.
Thank you. I think you have actually set out there, in a sense, quite a clear action plan. Reference the earlier question about how you view tackling that particular question, and it's a bit of a kind of complex thing in terms of there are different stages you have to go through. So thank you for summarising that. We're staying to some extent in the same sort of topic. I mean, I think people have obviously been very inspired by you talking about the next generation of actuaries, and also about how we move outside of our traditional areas. I think perhaps that pie chart really brought it to life for people in terms of the distance we still have to go. So I'm going to put together here a couple of questions, if the questioners will forgive me. Talking here, the questioner is thinking about how we engage with employers, but you talked about the entrepreneurial spirit as well, and that means not necessarily in those kind of large traditional employers. So how can we support members who maybe are either wanting to start their own businesses or work in smaller businesses, and how can we support those smaller employers? And also quite an interesting question from someone who provided some details which we'll share with you later about lots of interesting things that they've done that are very non-traditional. But the question is there a kind of conflict between what we do in new areas and the kinds of requirements we ask for from actuaries? So, and you've talked a little bit about things like the new credential paths and so on, but I think the question is saying, do we need different approaches to equip actuaries to be more entrepreneurial and to be able to work in these smaller and more different areas from the traditional ones? So I'm kind of merging those two questions because I think they're connected.
Yeah, okay. So look, all of our members are entrepreneurs. Yeah, you'd be amazed if that was the case. In fact, actuaries do tend to be perhaps towards the more introvert end of the spectrum, generally speaking, but that's a huge generalisation. I'm not expecting all of our members to tomorrow, having listened to my address today, to suddenly burst out and move into new field. That's not the way it works. But enough of our members do have that entrepreneurial mindset, and we need to identify them and support them in the right way. So we shouldn't, as I said, we haven't got the resources to be scattergun about this. We need to be focused. I mentioned it again, but climate sustainability is an obvious area where I think there is an opportunity that we should focus on. And to be frank, if we don't, if we aren't successful with climate and sustainability, which I think is, I've talked about it using a sporting analogy. It feels like we're a football analogy. We're through on goal. It's not quite an open goal, but we've just got the goalie to beat. So it's an opportunity that's there. We just need to take it. So we do need to be, proportionate in where we allocate resources. The second part of the question, and I think, the example I'd use, I suppose, is regulation, which I did talk about a bit, and I talked about that needing to be proportionate. One of the concerns we have with the Bayes consultation that I talked about was that it would be too broad brush. It would apply to just the members of the IFoA, but not to non-members doing the same role, which would have been wrong. But also that it would be applied across all our membership. And if that were to happen, it would be a real problem. It would really stifle that entrepreneurial spirit that I've spoken about. So we need to do everything in our power to stop that happening. And we're very much on the case there. So we're very much trying to make sure the outcome of that consultation is to focus on the key public interest actuarial roles. So I'm thinking there about roles like my previous role as Chief Actuary for Aviva, other Chief Actuary roles, scheme actuary roles, roles that really do have a really significant and direct impact on the public. I think it's absolutely appropriate that those individuals and people working them should be subject to more intense regulation than the majority of our members, who I think everyone should be subject to the Actuaries Code, I think, but some of the other TASs I don't think necessarily need to apply to all of our membership. So we need, and that's what I said at the end of my address, that we need to make sure that regulation doesn't stifle the innovation that we want.
So in a sense, the answer is regulation that enables and doesn't constrain where actuaries might work, but is proportionate and relevant to the type of role they do. And so that emphasis on the role is quite interesting. Yeah. Right, thank you for that. I am just going to say I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and we're doing quite well getting through the questions that you're sending in. So if you do think that you've still got a question you'd like answered before we get to the top of the hour, then please do stick it in the Q&A, and I will see if we can squeeze it in before the end. But in the meantime, we're going to slightly change tack. It's a bit more of a question about you in a way, Matt, as is sometimes the case at these presidential addresses. So you talked in your address about what you called the large world problems, which I think is a great phrase, and people can really understand what you mean by that. And the question is, how have you personally ensured that you can adapt to changes and to those large world problems during your career? So kind of what can we learn from how you approach those situations?
Sure, that's a good question there. So people talk about change as sort of a discrete thing that happens from time to time. I don't really see it that way. I think change is constantly happening. There's been huge change over my career. When I started at R. Watson & Son, all the calculations were done on a mainframe in the basement and were transposed by hand onto these big paper calculation sheets. we used razor blades to scratch out any errors. It was, that was only 30 years ago. It's hard to believe these days, but that's how it worked. We soon, in the early days of my career, we started to get PCs on our desk and use spreadsheets, and that's all changed, and it's gone to another level since then. And I think we'll go to another level again as we really get into the whole artificial intelligence and machine learning piece. So I think that change is coming, and it will be significant. I don't know when it will really start to accelerate, but when it does, I think it will happen faster than we all expect. That's generally true for change. What I would say personally, from my perspective, the toughest times in my career, I would say, have been when I haven't embraced change. So when I've tried to resist it, and I think my experience and my advice to anyone starting on their careers is not to do that. It is to embrace change. The most challenging times in my career has been when I've done that, moved outside my comfort zone, taken on a new type of work or moved into a new area. Quite stressful at the time, if I'm honest, but when you get to the end of the year and you look back on the year you've had, really rewarding, and those are the times that I feel I've really grown most as an individual and as an actuary. So I think that's what I would say. Have that sort of open mindset to embrace change. I see it as an opportunity rather than a threat. I think quite often our natural reactions to see change as a threat, and not to view it that way, and to embrace it and take on the possibilities and see what happens.
That's like very wise advice for all of us, Matt, and also I love the positive approach that is embodied in that answer. Actually, I'm going to kind of think about positivity and think about environment a bit, because you talked in your address about culture. That was one of the challenges that you set out, about making sure that we have the right culture. And I'm going to bring this quite close to home, because I'd be interested, and it was raised in some of the questions, but I'd be interested in what you think the practical steps are that the IFoA can take to accelerate and cement the transition that it's been trying to make in its own culture. So how are we doing? What more do we need to do to make sure we have the right culture?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, as I said in the address, I think we're on the right path. We've got the foundations there with the purpose and values. Again, it's not something you can't just change the culture overnight. It's something that takes time. But I am genuinely seeing a change. I have seen a change over the last 2 years. We just need to keep reinforcing that and keep reminding ourselves what our purpose and values are. I do remember at Aviva, the customer was very important for us at Aviva, and some teams went through a phase of, every meeting they had an empty chair in the meeting, and that chair represented the customer, and whether they were having discussions, they were encouraged to think what the customer would be thinking if they were listening to the conversation. The analogy for us would be to have that chair be our member, a member. Some teams even went as far as putting blow up dolls, I think, in the chair. As far as that, I'm not suggesting we go that far. I suppose the point is, in everything we do, we should try. I know it's difficult, but we should try and have the purpose and values in our heads, and make sure that everything we're doing is moving us in the right direction, particularly from a member perspective. And I think it's also important that senior management, such as yourself and obviously Stephen as CEO, council as well, and all our senior volunteers, set the right tone from the top. If everyone sees that example being set from the senior people within the profession, whether employees or volunteers, then I think we'll get there. We're moving in the right direction, and I'm confident we will get there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I like the idea of the chair for the member, or perhaps the box on our team screen when we're doing these things remotely. But I mean, certainly for me, it's been very positive and really good that we have this renewed emphasis and focus on the member, because you know, in a sense, we're nothing without that. But I agree with you that it takes a long time to get these things really cemented, and we do have to just keep, I think your word was reinforcing, that is our culture and that is what's important to us. So thank you for reinforcing that again this morning. I'm going to move us on into what I hope are probably the last couple of questions, looking at where we are with time and how the questions are going. This is a more general question, not just related to culture. It could be right across the spectrum of everything that you have talked about and everything we do. But the question is there anything that you think we should stop doing as a profession and as an organization?
Nothing's springing to mind, Annette, but I'm sure there are. In fact, I'm certain there are. I'm assuming most people on the call today are members, but there's probably a few IFoA employees as well, I hope. You know, I'd encourage, again, and going back to the question before, really, around culture, I'd encourage everyone to continue asking themselves when they're doing something: is it adding value? Is it moving the organisation in the right direction? It's human nature, sort of just to keep doing stuff that you've always done in the past, but we should challenge ourselves, I think, just to say, do we need to keep doing this? And if the answer to that question is no, and you're able to make that decision yourself, then make it and stop doing it, and probably you'll find that you're right, and no one will even notice that you've stopped doing it. If you're not sure, then refer to your line manager and have a conversation about it. But there we are. You know, we are a relatively small membership organisation. Costs and fees are an issue for us, and you know, we need to keep them tightly controlled. But that's one way of doing more, is to stop doing the stuff that's not really adding value, so we can focus our resources elsewhere.
And I think encouraging people, you know, whether it's people inside the IFoA or our members, encouraging them to ask that question as well, you know, in a sort of, you know, why do we do that? Do we need to do that? I think that can be very helpful as well, because it then allows the conversation to happen. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's just kind of asking the question every day, isn't it? And coming back to what is our purpose. So thank you very much for that. So we are, I think, moving into the territory of the last question, because there's only a few minutes left. We'll keep this, I hope, a sort of nice, short, sharp question and answer to finish off with. But it's really, again, thinking about you as president. So what are you most concerned about in the coming year? And what are you most looking forward to about the coming year?
Concerned about, I guess it would just be that there's a lot we need to get done, and I guess it links quite nicely actually to the previous question, Annette, about, you know, stopping doing stuff, because that there is, if we try and do everything that's on our plate at the moment, then my experience is that, you know, we'll end up doing things averagely if we're lucky, or potentially badly. So I think we need to be really, really focused on prioritizing things and making sure that the real priorities get done, and they get done really well. You know, a great example of that we've done recently is moving the exams online, which, you know, I've said before, but, you know, absent the pandemic, if we decided to do that, we'd have set up a project, you know, a 3-year project to get it done. It would have had a massive budget, and would have probably overrun time and budget wise. We didn't do that because we had the pandemic, and it was a necessity, and we got it done really quickly, really well. It was absolutely great example of absolutely ruthless execution, And I think we need more of that. But to do that, we need to make sure that we are focused on the priorities. We're going to do this year, we'll do it really well, and then we'll move on and do whatever we want to do next year. So that's my concern, I suppose, is that we sort of spread ourselves too thin and don't get the traction we need in the really important areas. In terms of the second part, what I'm looking forward to, I've already mentioned it, but I'm lucky really that hopefully the pandemic is behind us, and so I can hopefully step out from behind a screen like this and actually be more visible to stakeholders, in particular our members. As I mentioned, my desire to get out and about to regional societies, but just more broadly, that's the area that I feel really passionate about, and it's the area that I'm most looking forward to about being president, probably.
Thank you. And I know after the last couple of years, there's also a lot of appetite from our members to be able to meet with you and to be able to meet with each other. So hopefully we can bring all of those things together over the coming year. So as you will see, looking at the clock, we are effectively out of time now. So thank you, Matt, for I think what has been a very inspiring and aspiring presidential address. I think you have set out actually really quite a practical approach to those 6 big challenges that you see for the profession. And my sense from everything you said and the way you've answered the Q&A is that you think we are in very good shape to be able to flourish if we set about those challenges with, I suppose, with that open mind that you talked about, with that willingness to embrace the way that things change. I think I've taken a couple of actions out of the Q&A, so I've made a note of those. So I think there are some nice challenges that you've set down there. And I think you've also invited everyone who has been listening to this and everyone who cares about the profession to think about how they can contribute to tackling the challenges that you described. So something there for us all to take forward into our days and weeks ahead. I'm personally looking forward to working with you over the coming year so that we can focus on the flourishing part. I would like to thank everyone who has joined us for this session, and especially those of you who put a question in. I think we have managed to get through all or most of the questions that were put forward, so thank you. And of course, as always, it only remains for me, which I have to do on behalf of all of you in these virtual sessions, to pass on your thanks to Matt for that inspiring presidential address. And also, I think, the very candid and open answers to the questions that we received. Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you, Annette, and thank you everyone for joining.